Hello and welcome back to this damn fully dualistic crusade. This video is a review of the incredible Indicator box set of the Fu Manchu cycle 1965 to 1969. This is, of course, the Harry Allan Towers produced films in the 1960s based on the Sax Rohmer Fu Manchu character, all starring Christopher Lee as the title character. Now, these films are not terribly often discussed here in the US and have had some really terrible video releases, but in the UK were much more successful, and of course the series kept going as the first one proved a rather substantial financial success, which was unexpected. Now, of course, as soon as you say the name Harry Allan Towers, anyone who knows about this era of film should immediately know what that entails, which means, of course, a production that is, to say it could be a bit on the chaotic side is an understatement, but Towers was notorious for being able to put a film together almost overnight in various countries. In fact, he would almost boast about being able to do that on rather small budgets, and constantly be working or moving towards producing the next film, and often using finances that were supposed to be for said next film to then finish the film that they were currently working on. So every time you get to a Harry Allan Towers production, in terms of the films that he produced, they are almost always going to be a bit, I guess the best way to describe it is they're a little bit off kilter because of the nature of how they were produced. Now, the Fu Manchu cycle is generally viewed, most people have even thought perhaps that these are actually Hammer films, because they do try to, at least in some ways, mimic a lot of what you see in Hammer films, especially at this time in the early to mid-60s, and even use some of the same personnel behind Hammer films. So it's understandable that people might associate these as Hammer films, and especially since they all star Christopher Lee, but they are not Hammer films, and it should be stressed these are a separate thing, even though they do follow a lot of what you see in Hammer's adventure films, particularly their period adventure films. And of course, the first two films share the same director with some of those Hammer films, and the second film was shot at Bray Studios, so it's understandable why people would associate them with Hammer films when they are not. The other influence is rather obvious. These came out in the midst of the James Bond craze, and of course that led to the spy craze of the 1960s. And this started with Dr. No in 1962. Ian Fleming wrote Dr. No as a very definite nod towards growing up reading the Sax Rohmer Fu Manchu stories. So Dr. No himself is very much, some people have called the character a Fu Manchu clone, which I think is unfair, but you can definitely draw the direct comparison line. It is definitely there, and it was intended to be that way because the stories were very influential on Fleming when he was a young reader, as they were to most other young readers of Fleming's generation. So that is one thing, and I think Towers, even though he denied this, it seems rather obvious that was part of the impetus for doing Fu Manchu stories here at this time in the mid-1960s, because you would think by this point this would probably be a sort of character that people wouldn't really want to adapt, because it was becoming much more openly discussed and thought about that characters like this, with the inherent negative aspects and the inherent racism of the stories that created them from the period in which they were written in the 20s and 30s, obviously that doesn't date very well, and so the thought of doing a film like this today, of course, would never happen. But the fact that there was not just one, but a whole series of 5 films in the 1960s is definitely, it even seems a bit strange for them to have been done at this point in the mid-60s. But this is probably about the time period where, again, these issues would be discussed more openly, and people might think twice about doing stuff like this in terms of adapting these characters into films. But Towers did get a really good deal on licensing the characters from the Rohmer estate, but it seems like what he did was license the characters and not the stories. So while you have the characters of the same names in these films, they all vary wildly in terms of the stories they're telling, and none of them are really from the original Rohmer stories. So these kind of go off and do their own thing and don't really have a lot of basis in the original printed material that created these characters. So that also sets them apart even further. Of course, you have Christopher Lee playing the title character of Fu Manchu, which he had already played a similar sort of character in one of his first bigger leading roles for Hammer in Terror of the Tongs from 1961, which I have here on the Indicator Blu-ray. Now, this is the closest anyone had come to doing basically a Fu Manchu type story, and it was written by Jimmy Sangster and done as one of Hammer's period adventure films, after they did things like Stranglers of Bombay. I think it's a very underrated little Hammer picture, and it has a wonderful pulpy sort of energy, and that's what really makes the film work. However, you do have throughout actors wearing heavy makeup who are obviously Caucasian actors playing Asian characters, and since it is a very pulpy and it's a smaller Hammer film, it's obviously not going for extraordinarily well-rounded characterizations of all of the supporting players. So, and that plus the casting practices and it being a lower budgeted film, it obviously has some significantly dated aspects. However, it's still a ridiculously fun film due to the way that Jimmy Sangster wrote it, with a sort of wonderful, vicious glee to it. There's actually a pretty substantial body count, there is some gore, and a pretty notable torture sequence. And Christopher Lee plays the head of the Tong that the hero is fighting, and you can basically look at it as sort of a dry run for what he does with the Fu Manchu character here. Although it's a really great performance that is distinctly different from his Fu Manchu in these 5 films. But that's the sort of precursor to these, and I think another reason why people always want to link these to the Hammer films. Now, obviously, in these Fu Manchu films, you are going to run into that issue again of Caucasian actors being cast in Asian roles and having to wear makeup, particularly Christopher Lee with the eye makeup and eyebrows and the Fu Manchu mustache. Again, this is getting much closer to modern times, being in the mid to late 60s, so the thought of this still being a practice carried out, this is where it really starts to become rather patently obvious that this doesn't really fly, and it is something that you do have to sort of struggle with when you watch these films. Now, the daughter of Fu Manchu is played by Tsai Chin in these films, and she and Christopher Lee are in all 5 films. Unfortunately, in the later films, she's not given very much to do, but she herself has expressed feelings of it was a bit of a weird experience, and she doesn't necessarily know if she should have played this role in these films, that they were relatively enjoyable to make, but that she did have some guilt about making them because they were part of a extremely negative viewpoint of her culture, and so that was a sort of internal sort of conflict she had when even agreeing to do this series and play the role 5 times. So it is seeing these come out in, again, the mid to late 60s. It is kind of, I think, about the last point where you could kind of sort of get away with still having some older Hollywood type practices in terms of the casting and how you handle this material. However, I will say that, like I discussed with the Republic serial Drums of Fu Manchu, and also to a certain extent with the Paramount films with Warner Oland, these films, because they have more of a pulp adventure flavor to them, particularly the first 2, and because they're being made in the mid to late 60s, they do manage to subvert a lot of the inherent racism in the original characterization when you read the original stories, and so they are not as cringe-inducing as you might expect in terms of watching them for the first time, which I did for reviewing this set. So I had only seen little bits or read about these films, but I'd never seen them before, so I didn't quite know what to expect going in, but I was pleasantly surprised that thankfully there were no horribly cringe-inducing speeches and diatribes that you get in MGM's Mask of Fu Manchu, where they force poor Boris Karloff to then start spouting these awful speeches at various points about his crusade to rid the world of other races and things. It's just those are the worst part of Mask of Fu Manchu, and that's what most people really object to are those awful speeches that they give Karloff to spout. Well, thankfully you don't get any of that in these, just like in the Republic serial. So thankfully that is not a major issue here. And again, I think these being made later on, there was at least some greater sensibility about things like that. But again, a couple years down the road, I don't think you'd get away with making a Fu Manchu film with Christopher Lee in the title role, or really making a Fu Manchu film, period. So these are an interesting sort of time capsule for films that are sort of made like a Hammer period adventure film that's outside of their horror realm, but also because Harry Allan Towers had success with the first one, he decided to keep going back to the well, and you can clearly see after a certain point things go downhill really fast. And so this is not necessarily a series that I would recommend people to watch for enjoyment purposes, start to finish, each successive film, because after a certain point, your results are going to vary extraordinarily wildly, actually. But they are all fascinating to look at, and look at their productions and see how they were made, and see how each one starts to build on each other and then just completely go an opposite way after a certain point. And then the last two films really go off the deep end and have nothing to do with how the series started. And what is surprisingly 5 films cranked out in rather rapid succession suddenly end with a very firm what did I just sit through experience with the final film. So this is a very fascinating series to study, and I'm so glad and so very thankful that Indicator really has put in this incredible effort to present not just the 5 films, but basically the whole story and experience of their production, to give people the complete view into this rather interesting little section of film history. Now, the first film is 1965's The Face of Fu Manchu, which is easily the most polished of the 5 films, and this is usually the one that people will talk about the most and say is the best of the series, which is understandable. Some have even gone as far to say that it's the most polished and perhaps the best film that Harry Allan Towers ever produced, which is also understandable because this is a very impressive little film. It's does not have a great budget, but it's also a period adventure, a 1920s period adventure. So it is set in the time period of the original stories, and you have Fu Manchu, played by Christopher Lee, and of course his daughter, played by Sai Chen, and his acolytes battling for essentially trying to achieve world domination against his eternal foe, Sir Nayland Smith, played in this film by the always wonderful Nigel Green, and his associate, Dr. Petrie, played by Howard Marion Crawford, who also appears with Christopher Lee and Sai Chen in all 5 films of the series. So I guess you really have 3 constants besides Harry Allan Towers. So this is a very straightforward, wonderful period adventure with some pulpy energy to it that does make it go along at a nice pace. But the real secret weapon and what makes this picture work is its director, Don Sharp, who was a really wonderful director who had done a number of really important and interesting Hammer films, including, of course, some of the more notable horror films like Kiss of the Vampire, but he'd also done some of their adventure films, and just before this had done 1964's The Devil Ship Pirates, also with Christopher Lee. This is one of Hammer's period historical adventure films, and also one of their handful of pirate films. So if you've seen some of these, you'll know the sort of flavor this film has. And again, this is why I think a lot of people want to link this series to Hammer, especially because it has some of the flavor of some of the films Don Sharp would make for Hammer, both in their horror realm and for their adventure films. So Sharp is really the person that makes this picture work, because the one glaring problem I think anyone will have with all five of these films in varying degrees is that their stories are not, they're not particularly very gripping. And even when they are like this film, which is a very straightforward period pulpy adventure, it seems to just kind of go in fits and spurts in terms of the story. And you will probably go and look at the screenwriter, who is credited as Peter Welbeck. Well, that's not exactly who wrote it, because it's actually a pseudonym for Harry Allan Towers, who wrote the scripts for all the films, and he was not really a screenwriter. And that, I think, is the one big issue with all of these films that people are going to have, that you want to like this first film, and I still think it's a very enjoyable film. It's just that the story, while it has some rather nice set pieces and definitely has the most gravitas of all of the five films, it just kind of goes in fits and spurts, and it's up to Don Sharp to be the sort of engine that drives everything, and he does so impeccably. I think without Don Sharp, I don't think this picture would have worked. And his attention to detail and making the period atmosphere work on a shoestring budget in a lot of places is really effective. And this is capped off by the fact that the film was actually shot in scope, so it has a nicer sort of polish on it. That's why people always say this is the most polished of the series. It's also the only one in scope, so this is one of those series where the first film is sort of the most polished and essentially the fanciest looking, and it's also in scope, so it has that greater sense of importance to it, where all the other films were shot flat. The film is also helped immeasurably by Christopher Lee's performance as Fu Manchu. Lee was apparently a fan of the original Rohmer stories and was rather excited to play the character, and also try to do something different from what he had done in Terror of the Tongs. So he plays it with a very sort of internalized menace. He uses his stillness very, very well, because of course Lee was a very tall man and had a physically imposing sense just whenever he appeared on camera, regardless of what the role he was playing. And he had this incredible ability to use his physical stature, and of course had trained as a mime, which helped him immeasurably in playing the creature in Curse of Frankenstein, and of course Dracula, but probably most effectively when playing Caris in Hammer's version of The Mummy. So he uses some of that to radiate a sense of menace. He's also, he speaks in a particular sort of, almost a sort of clipped manner of speaking, as if Fu Manchu has constant disdain for all of the people he's having to deal with, because he just wants to dominate the world. So it fits the character perfectly. And he's also always hanging out in the background, always sending his acolytes out to do things, trying to be the sort of villain in control of things behind the scenes, which is how this character was conceived. So that only adds to the sense of mystery and menace surrounding him. However, I think that even Lee is outdone, because if this entire run of films has a single great performance that really makes them worth watching, even greater than Lee's performance here, I think, is Nigel Green's performance as Sir Nayland Smith. He manages to have this incredible sense of drive and purpose, because Smith is supposed to be he was created very much in the mold of Sherlock Holmes, and Dr. Petrie, recounting his adventures, is very much patterned on Dr. Watson, and Rohmer was clearly inspired by Conan Doyle and the Holmes stories. So you have that sort of paradigm here with Smith and Dr. Petrie. But Smith, like Holmes, has a certain coldness to him, but he also has this particular obsession with Fu Manchu and the constant battles they have back and forth, even when one may think the other is dead. I've always felt that Greene was a terribly underrated actor. He's mostly known for his character roles. My personal favorite is his performance in the Ipcress File. But here he plays Smith again with this sense of drive, but he really hammers home this sense of obsession and has this wonderful sort of balance between this intensive frostiness that seems to be within him, this coldness that I referred to that you see in Sherlock Holmes and comes up in some Holmes adaptations more than others, depending on how they formulate the character. But also meshing that coldness with the sense of drive and the obsession to make him a very active participant in things going on. He even gets into some fight scenes, and he's always throwing himself into the action. So he is, I think, the character that drives this film forward, and the absolute best moments are when you have Greene as Smith and Lee as Fu Manchu going toe-to-toe in some nice dialogue scenes. So I think it's Greene's performance along with Sharp's direction and Lee's performance as Fu Manchu that make this film, along with the period atmosphere and the polish and the scope photography, so effective. Because I think without all of those elements, you'd be much more easily able to focus on the inherent shortcomings of the script. However, it is still a well-put-together story. There are several really interesting sequences. I think perhaps the best one is when Fu Manchu threatens an entire city to get the government of London to believe him, and when he carries out his threat, he wipes out the entire population of a city, and it is extraordinarily well done and effective and very chilling in the simplest of ways, and it is perfectly sticking to the old adage of, simplicity is always much better than going over the top with effects. And of course, they didn't have the money to do any effects work. So that on also the killing of an acolyte who has displeased Fu Manchu in a rather nasty way is rather effectively done and also helps to set up the climax. So I can understand people saying that Face of Fu Manchu is the best of the series. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I do think it is a surprisingly effective film that will encourage you to continue with the rest of the films, because if you see the first film in a series and you know there's more of them and the first film doesn't really work, you're not really going to want to go through the other films. But it's the lead performances, the polish of this film, the period atmosphere, the energy, the film having some pulp energy to it to really give it some adventure flavor, some of the lovely set pieces, but especially above all else, Don Sharp's direction. That's what makes this film work. That's what makes it tick. And that's what makes you, when you get to the end, and we have the line that will occur in all of these films when the presence of Fu Manchu intonates to the audience, "The world shall hear of me again," that you actually want to see what happens when the world hears of Fu Manchu again in the second film. So it's debatable which film people might prefer the most, but it's no real secret that the first film, The Face of Fu Manchu, is the most polished and generally considered to be the best of the series. It was also a rather sizable financial hit in both the US and the UK, which is really surprising. Towers had made this a co-production deal with different entities in different countries, so there was a lot of different money involved, and this was distributed by Warner Brothers here in the US, and so it actually apparently clicked with audiences on both sides of the pond. So that's, of course, made Towers want to go back to the well and immediately jump into a second film. To talk about the picture quality of this release, Indicator has given this film and all the films in this set a brand new 4K scan of the original negatives. This results in an image that is just so far beyond any previous video version of these films that if you've seen these before, and they've existed in some really terrible versions due to how the rights have been spread around over the years, these will be a revelation. They're a revelation if you've never seen them before, because, again, these are all 4K negative scans that have been meticulously put together here. If that was not enough, Indicator has also made this a special transfer with seamless branching, because they discovered that apparently the reel 3 of the original negative had been damaged on the original in the lab somehow when it was originally processed, and it had significant scratching along the left edge. And that for the original release, it was simply cropped out by usually just zooming in on the image. And so that's how the film was always stuck after that point. They did that to just cover up the damage. So they've actually given you the option when you go to the menu, if you want to see the film with the reel 3 as it was released, sort of zoomed in and cropped off on the left side a little bit, or to watch the entirety of the image with the printed in damage from their straight negative scan, which is a fascinating thing that I don't know if I've ever seen that done before in this particular way, giving you the option for the entirety of the damaged section. And then when you actually get to that, and I'll include some images here, it's not that bad. So I would actually just say, just go ahead and watch the version with the full image area. It's actually, it's not the horrible thing you expect. So I'm just beyond thrilled that we get the option. And that's, of course, another sign to the sort of quality control and level of care that Indicator puts into these releases. Not just that they did a new 4K scan from the original camera negative of films that you would just never think would get this treatment, but also to research the damage they discovered, figure out how it was handled originally in 1965, and then give you the option to view it either way. I mean, that is above and beyond in terms of putting effort into physical media releases. So that's the big major technical thing with this particular film on the Indicator release, that you have the option to view the third reel with or without the damage. Now, the actual transfer is absolutely gorgeous. The film was shot in Techniscope, so it's not true anamorphic scope, but being in Techniscope, that allows you to still maintain your depth of field without anamorphic fall off. And the 60s were really the prime era for Techniscope films. So this is, of course, the same process that Sergio Leone would make famous with his westerns. It was also used on the Ipcris file, also in 1965. It was a means of cutting costs on the actual film processing work and not having to spend as much on film stock, and it would give you a beautiful scope image at the cost of, obviously the resolution wasn't the same, but it also meant you could use spherical lenses. So it's an interesting process that I always love seeing beautiful transfers of, and this was a real treat to see a 4K negative scan of a Techniscope film, which is also very hard to transfer correctly. So my hat's off to Indicator even further for putting this effort into a Techniscope film. Now, this doesn't mean that the element is completely free of defects. You will see every once in a while they are just extraordinarily minor bits of dirt and debris, maybe a slight scratch or two, a slight hair or two poking in, and maybe a tiny little bit of a line poking in here and there. This seems mostly to be inherent to the original source and probably is baked into the original negative, I would assume. And Indicator has gone in and tried to clean things up as best as possible, but not go overzealously into the overboard territory by over cleaning things as most people would do. So do expect with all of these transfers to see the occasional bit of age-related wear just in the slightest possible ways, or again, things that are probably most likely inherent in the original negative elements themselves. And of course, obviously, there's nothing you can do about those. So again, don't expect these to be 100% pristine, but they are a beautiful archival transfer for all of these films. But again, Face of Fu Manchu being the most polished and technically the richest looking, this will obviously be the visual standout of the set, and again, it's the only one in scope. Now, in terms of the audio, this has the film's original mono mix and lossless quality. It also has been a part of this restoration process, and it sounds quite excellent, but you will have to expect some age-related wear. There is a little bit of distortion in the highest music cues. There is a little bit of audible hum under the dialogue in a couple places, but it's rather minor. This is all seemingly inherent to the original elements, and of course, I'd much rather have an archival archival, hands-off transfer of a film's audio instead of somebody going to town with noise reduction to try and remove things, and then they wind up removing part of the actual soundtrack, which unfortunately happens on the vast majority of releases, especially on older mono tracks, which are much more limited than a modern discrete track. So I think the film's audio sounds extraordinarily healthy, even though you do need to expect some age-related wear and some age-related issues. Now let's talk about the packaging. Indicator's given this one of their beautiful box-exclusive digipacks with original artwork. So this has the original US 1 sheet artwork, which is very striking and has been beautifully printed on this textured digipack with custom spine and, of course, spine numbering for this release. Indicator also has included various foreign artwork for the interior, again, beautifully printed, and then the very striking image on the disc label, and then more lovely imagery for the disc tray. And then you come to the back for the supplemental features. And, of course, Indicator has done their usual everything in the kitchen sink in terms of giving you as many extras as is humanly possible. And then they've gone beyond even that, because this set is loaded with supplemental features. So to go over these for the ones included with this film, of course, the new restoration from a 4K scan of the original negative, with the original mono audio also restored. Then we get the first audio commentary, which is between Stephen Jones and Kim Newman, who have done, of course, many horror film commentaries and are a wonderful double act in audio commentaries, and this is no exception. This is a wonderful, extremely informative audio commentary on the production and aftermath of The Face of Fu Manchu, Harry Allan Towers' is rather a notoriously legendary career, where this film comes in Christopher Lee's career, what it did for Nigel Greene's career, why he didn't continue with the series. All kinds of different things are covered here, so this is really an essential listen and a fantastic commentary. But then we get the second audio commentary, because one is not enough for Indicator, which is how things should be. This is from the incredible British Entertainment History Project. This is actually the first part of a career retrospective interview with Don Sharp. So the second part is in the second film, but this runs the entire 96-minute length of the film, and it is Don Sharp talking about his entire career up to where the interview stops, and then basically the second half of his career picks up on the next disc. So this basically takes the place of a second commentary, and Don Sharp does actually talk at great length about Harry Allan Towers, and then when he gets to this point, after he talks about Hammer, he talks about making these films and trying to get them off the ground and trying to make them work, and he was apparently quite proud of the efforts they achieved with this first film, as was Christopher Lee. I think everybody was pretty much proud of how well this one turned out. So this is an absolute treasure for historical purposes and knowing more about the British film industry at this time, and also hearing the words directly from Don Sharp himself. It is a wonderful listen and an outstanding second commentary. But then we get a third audio commentary, also from the British Entertainment History Project, and this one is with Ernest Stewart, who talks about the first half of his career, and he, of course, was the cinematographer. So it's fascinating hearing from his perspective and his history in the British film industry from the original source himself, so you get that straight from the horse's mouth quality. This is also an incredible historical treasure for knowing more about the British film industry. I absolutely adore these things, and it's just phenomenal that you can have it here on the Indicator release and essentially get a third commentary that's also a historical treasure trove about an entire section of film history that just does not get covered enough. And then there's a fascinating little archival interview with Christopher Lee done in 1965 when the film was finishing up. It's a little black and white interview, but he seems to be in really good spirits, so it's a fascinating little time capsule interview. So that was a fascinating inclusion. Then we also get Vic Pratt introducing The Face of Fu Manchu. This is a piece. He does an introduction piece for each of the films, so it's probably best if you're new to these films to watch his introductions first, or you can watch them after. I actually watched them after because I liked his little sort of miniature commentaries, and you can either watch them before or after, but it's a lovely inclusion to get someone's honest thoughts on these films and their place in film history here in the modern age. So it's a very nice inclusion that he did one for each of the 5 films. Then in one of the set's best extras, we get Underneath the Skin, which is a 49-minute piece by Sir Christopher Frayling about the character of Fu Manchu, the inherent racism of the character in the original stories, and the whole sort of section of media that existed at the time Fu Manchu was most popular that unfortunately was sort of steeped and composed of racism. And he, of course, has written an entire book on the subject, so he is the perfect person to have speak about this. And he goes in great length and detail about how the character was created, the literary precursors, the influence of the character, how Rohmer developed over time as a writer, how the character developed over time, and then also at great length about the adaptations of the character and how it sort of changed and reshaped over the years. And then, of course, getting up to the Towers films of the 1960s. So this is, it's almost an hour long. And of course, anytime you get Sir Christopher Frayling going on about any film topic, it is worth its weight in gold. And of course, he's written an entire book on the subject, so he's the perfect person to get to talk about this. So this is the perfect extra for understanding the historical context and the inherent baggage that this character always brings along, and is still here in these films because they are obviously dated in certain aspects. So this is an extraordinarily important extra, and I'm so happy that it's actually a nice, really lengthy piece that gets into the nuts and bolts of this particular issue, which you do have to cover when talking about these films. Then we also get alternative titles and credit sequences, because these films usually had different titles depending on the countries they were released in. And then Indicator also has made sure to include these in HD, so apparently they also did fresh scans of these sources as well. So these aren't some old crummy version from who knows where. These are actual HD scans of the alternative credit sequences. We also get brand new scans of the original Super 8 home cut-down versions, and these also had to, they actually were given out or sold with optional soundtracks on a little vinyl record. And they've actually gone to the lengths of capturing the audio from those original vinyl record soundtracks. So they are actually synced to the original picture now. So you can actually have the experience of watching the Super 8 home cut down version digest with or without its original optional vinyl soundtrack, which of course cost more back in the day, and most kids couldn't afford that, so they just get the silent film itself. So these are a phenomenal inclusion, and the fact that they actually went and got the actual soundtrack audio from the original vinyl discs themselves is just, I can't believe they did that. So this is an incredible time capsule experience of the basic gist of how home video started, with a Super 8 digest that was silent, and then if you had the extra money, you could pay for the little vinyl soundtrack. Then you had to try and sync it to your Super 8 projector. So it's a phenomenal inclusion that they did that, and also went and got the vinyl soundtrack audio. Then they have also included the original UK, German, and French theatrical trailers. These are all in HD. They all seem to be new scans. And the foreign trailers have brand new subtitles made for them actually by Indicator themselves, which is a fascinating inclusion because some of the narration in the foreign trailers is wonderfully entertaining. So that was a beautiful touch. And we also get a very substantial image gallery with promotional and publicity material and posters and stills and lobby cards, up to Indicator's usual high standard. Then they've also made new and improved English subtitles, and this is the film's world premiere on Blu-ray. This is a really substantially loaded release and an easy recommendation to pick up from the Indicator website of a film that is surprisingly much more effective than you would expect. I do think this is one of the strongest films in the set. I don't think it's a secret the two Don Sharp films are the strongest and the best of the series, but this is the one that most people point to as being the most polished and the best overall, which is understandable. I think it's really helped along by Lee's lead performance, by Don Sharp's direction, and Nigel Green's phenomenal performance as Nayland Smith. I think after seeing this, you can't help but picture a Sherlock Holmes film that doesn't exist, where Nigel Green played Holmes with the same sort of drive, because he would have made a phenomenal Sherlock Holmes. And it's absolutely mind-boggling that he never did play Sherlock Holmes. But of course, the actor who replaced him in the sequel was known for being a rather famous and highly regarded Sherlock Holmes himself, Douglas Wilmer. But it's a shame that that Green did not stay on with the series, at least for another film, because he's so exceptional in this film that I think his performance is actually the best of all 5 films. But this is still a really wonderful period adventure that I think anyone who loves period adventures or loves just adventure films in general or pulp adventures, this is right up your alley, and again, phenomenally effective for its rather meager production. It really manages to overcome all of those aspects and be a rather remarkable little film. Next comes the film's sequel, The Brides of Fu Manchu, made the very next year in 1966, with most of the same cast and crew returning. So basically, the first film was such an unexpected success that Harry Allan Towers immediately had started plans on a second film and hit upon the idea of making this an ongoing series for as long as they could sort of mine this vein of popularity. So it was, of course, very wise to maintain as many of the same key crew and personnel as they could. The big changeover is seen, though, in a couple different ways. As I've said before, the first film is the only film that was shot in the scope format, or at least was shot in Techniscope, so it has a scope aspect ratio. Starting with Brides, we are in spherical territory. This film is in the 1:8:5 ratio. The remaining films in the cycle are in the more European standard of 1.66:1. This was also shot at Bray Studios, which of course was the legendary home of Hammer Films, which is another reason why a lot of people usually associate these films with Hammer, even though they have nothing to do with Hammer. So this one is probably the most obvious Hammer-esque. And of course, you have Don Sharp, again, directing a film at Hammer's Bray Studios in the adventure mold that he had done and some of their pirate films. So, as I've said, you can see the connections, but this one is the most obvious because it was actually shot at Bray Studios. And some of the sets they come up with, and the fact that it's in a spherical non-scope ratio, as most Hammer films were, and you have a key Hammer director, and it's Christopher Lee, it does have the most trappings of it being a Hammer horror film, even though it still is not a Hammer horror film. Now, this is the point where most people write this series off as sort of law of diminishing returns. Everyone, the usual general consensus is that the first film is the strongest, and then after that, your results may vary. However, I do think that is actually quite a bit unfair, because there is at least quite a bit of mileage you can get out of the second and third film. And in spite of 2 elements that might be seen as downgrades to some people, honestly, the second film is far stronger than what people give it credit for. The downgrades I'm alluding to is chief and foremost, we have a new Nayland Smith. The original film, of course, had Nigel Green, who I think gives a phenomenal performance and is my favorite performance overall of all of these films. And it's a shame he didn't stay on with the series, but they did get an interesting replacement. Nayland Smith, of course, is very Sherlock Holmes-like, and so they wound up getting one of the most notable Holmes actors in Douglas Wilmer to play Sir Nayland Smith here. And he brings a certain warmth to the role that was not there in the Nigel Green performance, and where you could see Green's characterization being very Holmes-like and very dogged in his pursuit of Fu Manchu. Here, the Holmes parallels are extremely in your face in terms of it having the Holmes and Watson dynamic, and this is picking up on all the stuff that was in there in the original Sax Rohmer stories, because these characters were directly patterned on Holmes and Watson. So it's made much more obvious here, but you don't have the same intensity and drive to the Nayland Smith character. You don't have that same sense of a pathological obsession of getting Fu Manchu. Instead, you have almost a sort of paternal feeling, and there's something nice about that. You get a sort of again, this nice sense of warmth, and Wilmer's interactions with Howard Marion Crawford, again returning to play Dr. Petrie, is wonderful, and there is a slight dash of more of a comedic element here and there in terms of the interactions, but it's never overdone to make them into sort of klutz characters, as would unfortunately happen in some of the later films a little bit. So it's a definite switch. It is a different tone and approach to the character, but I don't think it's a downgrade, because I do think it works really well. It's just after the first film having such a striking Nayland Smith with the Nigel Green performance, it is a definite shift. But we are otherwise in the same territory, with Don Sharp returning to direct, most of the same cast and crew. The other big thing that's going to be seen as a downgrade by some people is, again, it's no longer in a scope ratio, which usually indicates that it's a production that didn't want to spend the extra money for anamorphic lenses and processing, or they decided to no longer stay with Techniscope and they just went for flat spherical photography. However, again, I don't think that's a downgrade, because this film, because I guess they're shooting at Bray, and you have a lot of the wonderful, incredible Bray technicians who made all the Hammer films what they were, plus one of Hammer's great directors, and the sense of, hey, we achieved something with the first film, and now we're going to do another one. So with that feeling of some success, there's naturally a bit of the pressure off, and everyone gets to enjoy doing the second film and going a little bit deeper and playing around with things a little bit. Because, to be quite honest, I think this is the best film of the cycle. I think it is actually better than the first film. This film, Brides of Fu Manchu, the reason why I think it's better, this has all of the strengths of the first film, except it seems to embrace its pulpy nature more. It is a much more fully invested pulp adventure than even the first film was. It's still a period drama, a historical adventure. It still has some, obviously very pulpy aspects to the plot that may not necessarily be the most realistic, but this one just revels in it. This one really just has energy to it, like the first film did, but it doesn't sag in terms of its plotting as much, and I think that also helps it immensely. Again, you do have the problem of this film being written by Harry Allan Towers under a pseudonym, so he is not the greatest screenwriter in the world. However, because this film has more energy, and because the plot's a bit tighter, even if it is, totally nuts in a few places, it's totally nuts in a wonderful pulpy adventure sense. You could honestly picture this same story being told in an original, in say one of the Fu Manchu novels, even though Towers was not adapting any of the Fu Manchu works. He was pretty much just taking some of the character names and then just making stuff up from there. And the question has always been, well, if you were going to license these characters, wouldn't you adapt the stories? But it's also been thought that perhaps he didn't want to pay the extra money to do that and just paid for the character names. But I think this is the one instance where it works best. This is also very clearly inspired by the James Bond films. This is the most Bondian of the films. Fu Manchu has a world takeover plot. He has a villain's lair with a control room. He has all the technicians. He and Nayland Smith are going toe-to-toe across the world, and Nayland Smith essentially has to stop Fu Manchu's evil plot for world domination. The brides of the title come from the fact that in order to achieve his goals, Fu Manchu is having to basically get all these scientists together and blackmail them, and he usually does this by also kidnapping their daughters and using that to blackmail the scientists to do his bidding, and of course then essentially winds up with a sort of prison/harem full of scantily clad women and doing his bidding and being hypnotized. And the film actually opens with a rather striking moment. So this is a film that just does not beat around the bush. It definitely gets in there with almost a sort of pre-title sequence, really, and we are right there and in the exotic adventure land of Fu Manchu. So you have the sort of fun, slightly wacky, slightly obviously not the most realistic way to go about your world domination plot. Pulpy elements are they're here in full force, and again, because the film just really just hits the ground running and never lets up, I think that's why it plays a bit better. So it may not be as polished as the first film, and the period detail may not be as extensive. And obviously, there's they're much more on interior sets, but they're interior sets at Bray Studios. And honestly, I think the interior sets here do look a bit better than the interior sets in the first film. It does have a feeling of there's more budget here, but I think they were able to stretch their budget further, in addition to not having as much location shooting. But chiefly, you can't overlook the fact that the film's greatest strength here is that you have Don Sharp really just driving the film along, so that way there's a good pace and rhythm that's established and maintained, so you don't get bogged down and start to question what the heck you're watching and why are they doing these silly things. Every pulp adventure type story needs a good pace. It's Hitchcock's old stratagem of you have to keep the audience invested, otherwise they're going to start questioning the movie in the theater, and you don't want them to do that. You want them to do that when they're driving home, when they start complaining to everyone else in the car that the movie didn't make any sense. And this, combined with Nayland Smith being now more warm and sort of paternal, and Christopher Lee giving another really committed Fu Manchu performance, and the greater sense of Bondian elements, this is a sort of growth from the first film. It is also basically following a lot of the same patterns, but it doesn't seem as consistently getting bogged down in terms of its plotting. And with Don Sharp being behind the camera, keeping everyone constantly moving and having a greater sense of opulence from the sets at Bray Studios, this one just feels the liveliest of the films. And even though the first film, Face of Fu Manchu, is more polished, and a lot of people say that's the only great one or the only really good one, I have to disagree, because I do think that The Brides of Fu Manchu is actually the stronger film, because it is the one that most gleefully admits its pulp fiction origins and just gets down to the business of having a fun pulp adventure. And if that wasn't enough, we see one of the great legendary character actors of this time pop up in Burt Kwok, who has a nice sort of, he's sort of the chief assistant minion in Fu Manchu's control room area. And he's one of the people that anytime he pops up in any film, I just get ridiculously happy, even though he's just, fulfilling the same type of role we've seen countless times of the man behind the control console who says, no, you can't go past the danger level, everything will explode. And of course, at some point we're going to go past the danger level and everything's going to explode. So this film, I think, just has the most charm to it. And this is the film you will be thinking back to most, or at least I was, when you go through the rest of the films. I think after this point, what people say about the first film, that all the sequels, your results may vary. I think it should be after the first two Don Sharp directed films, your results may vary. And I'll also say your results may vary wildly, because some people love the films after this point. Some people love the third film. But honestly, when you get to the end of this series, it goes into a completely different territory. So after this point, after the first two Don Sharp directed films, the series no longer follows the pattern established by Face of Fu Manchu. The third film is wildly different and was shot in Hong Kong mostly, and then the last two films just go completely different places as well. So the first two films are sort of a unit, and honestly, if anyone is curious about these, I would strongly recommend watching the first two films directed by Don Sharp. They're the ones that have the most classical pulp adventure feel to them. They work as wonderful historical period adventure films, in spite of the inherent dated aspects that you're going to see in terms of, obviously, Caucasian actors in in makeup, particularly the eye makeup for Christopher Lee and for a lot of the acolytes and Fu Manchu's henchmen. There are a lot of stuntmen with obvious makeup on, and sometimes it's rather obviously poor makeup, but that's just again something that you're going to run into with anything dealing with subject matter like this. But I do think the first two films are really wonderful in their own ways. They have great charm, and they do have a good deal of classic cliffhanger adventure serial flavor. This one probably even more than the first film. So this one is undoubtedly my favorite of the series, and it's probably also because they shot it at Bray Studios, and it is the most Bondian in feeling. So I guess that's why naturally I sort of gravitate towards this one over Face of Fu Manchu. But I do think this film is very underrated. I think that to simply overlook the other films and just say the first one's the only good one is doing them a disservice, whether you like the directions they go in after the second film, because the second film, again, it's pretty much joined at the hip with the first film. Imagine the first film, but much more obviously adventure-driven, and that's what you get in The Brides of Fu Manchu. Now, to talk about the picture and audio quality, this is, again, a brand new 4K scan of the original camera negative, supervised and handled entirely by Indicator Powerhouse themselves, and the beauty of the visuals just jump out of the screen. This is a gorgeous transfer, just like the first film. The picture transfers on all of these films, I think, are their greatest selling point. And these, again, are, as I said with the first film, Indicator did not go in and try to hide the flaws of the source. So if you're an eagle-eyed viewer, or you're very much aware of how film conditioned can be after all this time, and about the ins and outs of cleanup and restoration, you are going to notice the occasional little bit of inherent things going on. There is just the most fleeting amounts of maybe a little bit of wobble in some of the credits, which seem natural and inherent to the source. When you get to the opticals, especially all the dissolves and things, because of course those are not original camera negative, you're going to see the quality difference really jump out at you, because the new scan and presentation is so beautiful of the rest of the film that when you get to the opticals, you're going to see the generational loss be very apparent. Again, the strength of the visuals really make up a great portion of your enjoyment of seeing these films in these new transfers, because before this point they've looked like utter garbage, and the fact that Indicator went to these lengths for these films is really remarkable, because they're practically never discussed, and especially not here in the States. This may be actually the best looking film because of the much more varied and vivid color palette as compared to the first film. The fact that it's in 185 instead of Techniscope, and they shot it at Bray Studios. So this, it looks like a phenomenal transfer of a Hammer film. And again, not to again stress, these are not Hammer films, but with this film, you can very much understand why people think they are Hammer films, because this looks like one of the best Blu-rays ever made of a Hammer horror film, even though it's not a Hammer horror film, because it has a lot of the same trappings of them, because it was shot at the same studio at the same time with one of their big directors. I did notice some very, very slight occasional lines trying to poke in a little bit here and there, and I'm sure that's probably intrinsic to the original source. I don't think these films were probably stored very well, especially knowing all of the various long history of cost-cutting maneuvers that involve any film involving Harry Allan Towers. So I think it's a remarkable experience to see them looking this good, because they're pretty much near pristine. And so anytime there's an original sort of bit of inherent damage, or a quibble that would otherwise be not really noticeable, the film looks so beautiful and is given such new life in this transfer that any of the most slight little things, which all of these are extremely slight, you're going to notice them much more than you would on an average transfer that was only so-so. So this is very much, again, like with all the other films in the set, an as-is archivally minded presentation, which is really how all films should be treated. But this film being more colorful than the first film and having some much more expansive Hammer-esque sets at Bray. It just seemed to really just leap out of the screen more than the others, and I was really just very pleasantly surprised by how beautiful this looked. In terms of the audio, it's once again the original mono mix and lossless quality. It has not been, thankfully, over scrubbed or anything, so there is some natural hiss there. There are a couple spots where the hiss does seem a bit more in terms of the intensity of it. It's never obtrusive or bad, and of course you really want to just leave that stuff alone rather than try and take it all out and take parts of the soundtrack with it. There are one or two spots where you will hear, depending on how good your sound system is, there are one or two spots where there's some inherent noise, and very, very faintly, but much more there's like an occasional tiny bit of hum that pops up here and there, very faint, and maybe a little tiny thump or two, but those do seem inherent, and again, I would much rather have them there as is in a lovely high-resolution, lossless transfer of the original audio of a film rather than having an over-scrubbed and tinny-sounding soundtrack, which unfortunately happens far more than it should on most releases. So I was very happy with the audio, as with all the other audio presentations here. So pretty much all of these, I'm going to be saying the same thing on all these transfers, because they didn't go in and try to fully scrub the life out of the picture and sounds. These are, again, very much archivally minded transfers that do maintain some of the inherent defects of the original source material, none of which are detractive from your viewing experience, but the more closely you look at these things, the more you'll be able to note things like this. Now we come to the packaging. This has a beautiful rendering of one of the original posters, which has the cheeky tagline. Again, these are so beautifully printed that they just jump off of the custom digipack. We have the spine with the numbering, then the beautiful interior with a German poster, and then the disc label, and then the tray underneath has a close-up view of more beautiful looking artwork. And then we come to the absolutely stuffed supplemental section. Now, I will first mention the fact that you're actually getting two versions of the film that are offered on this presentation. And by that, I mean they give you the option to view the film with the US opening, which is essentially a prologue that adds a minute to the runtime. And this is essentially doing a recap. So it's very much, as I said, this film has the most serial energy. Well, if you watch this, it very much feels like you're coming into the new chapter of a cliffhanger serial, because they just do a recap of the end of the first film. And it's obviously duped in and cropped, so the quality is very diminished. But it's a beautiful thing to see, and I would recommend everyone to watch this film with the prologue just to have that sort of vintage flavor of it being a serial. Plus, you know, it's only a minute long, and it's admittedly really fun, but Indicator has given you the option to view it as the original UK release version, which is a minute shorter because it doesn't have this prologue. So that is seamlessly branched, and the prologue has been newly transferred in HD. However, it is a compromised source because it was just duped footage from the first film and cropped, and, you know, obviously doesn't look as good as the rest of the transfer of the second film or the first film's transfer, but it's a beautiful thing for them to have actually gone in and scanned that fresh to include here as the branched option. Then we get the first audio commentary, which is with Kevin Lyons and Jonathan Rigby, so a wonderful pair we know and love from all of their Hammer commentaries and other commentary tracks. It's an absolute must listen. Another phenomenal commentary in this set. Then we move to the second audio commentary, which picks up with part 2 of the Don Sharp career interview for the British Entertainment History Project. So again, that forms an entire second commentary track. So you can listen to these back to back if you want, or just listen to the first part and then come to the second part here. So that runs the length of the film as the second commentary track and is just as good as the first part. And then commentary 3 is the interview part 2 with Ernest Stewart. So again, picking up from the first section as the commentary on the first disc. So these inclusions of what I like to call oral histories of the British film industry are absolute treasure troves, and I am so thrilled that Indicator keeps doing these. It's an incredible resource. I recommend everyone listen to these. Even if you've never heard of any of the films or people that they're talking about, you will learn so much and get such a bird's eye perspective of the British film industry's development that these are just an invaluable resource. And again, this film has not one, but 3 full-length audio commentaries. So after the commentaries, then we get the Guardian interview with Christopher Lee, which was done in 1994, which is 87 minutes long. It's basically an interview with some Q&A sessions, but Indicator has actually re-edited the footage new for this release, so it's not just a single static camera as most of these are. This is a surviving vintage interview with Lee, who is actually quite engaged and gets into a lot of detail about his career and is very animated, so that makes it a wonderful watch. But it's really even made even better by the fact that Indicator's taken the time to actually take all of the footage from the multiple cameras and do a nice edit of them, so it's not just static throughout. And again, it's a lengthy, 87 minutes, so it's almost an hour and a half long. And for all of us Christopher Lee fans, any interview footage at length with Lee is a must and a treasure. Then we get another Vic Pratt introduction specifically for The Brides of Fu Manchu, which runs 7 minutes and is essential if you've never seen these films. He does a wonderful job of explaining where they come, how they differ from each other, and the historical context of them. Then we go, and talking about historical context, we get Pages of Peril, which is a 21-minute piece where Kim Newman talks about the Sax Rohmer novels, their development, and the various adaptations. So basically, it's one of the Kim Newman pieces we all know and love, of him being surrounded by an ever-growing piles of media that we're all doing the bookshelf scans of, but talking entirely about Sax Rohmer's creation and its development over time. So that's another absolutely essential extra. And again, you wish it was twice as long, but he talks so quickly and it covers so much that it's more like an hour's worth of information crammed into a wonderful 20 minutes. Then we do get also the original trailer, which is newly scanned in HD, so it is a very lovely looking trailer presentation. We get an original TV spot. Then we also get the image gallery, which is once again a stuffed, beautifully done Indicator affair with high-res images, set stills, production stills, lobby cards, posters, and also a lot of foreign artwork, so you get to see the whole production campaign of the film. Then, of course, new and improved English subtitles, and this is the film's Blu-ray premiere. So once again, this is an absolutely essential Blu-ray, and just an incredible presentation from start to finish. The packaging, the artwork, the supplemental features are absolutely stunning, as is the picture and audio transfer. And again, this is my favorite film of the set, and I think this is such an enjoyable historical period pulp adventure that I think if you even like the sound of any of these, I think the whole set is worthwhile just for this film alone. Next we come to 1967's The Vengeance of Fu Manchu, directed by Jeremy Summers. This is the 3rd film in the series, and this one, as I said before, was shot primarily in Hong Kong, so this has a completely different flavor to it from the first 2 films, and it adds a nice sort of almost an exotic quality to it, because you can very much feel that this is a different film simply due to the fact that even if you didn't know it was shot in Hong Kong, it visually looks different and it feels different. But you also lose Don Sharp's direction. And I think Jeremy Summers does a good job with this film, but I also think that it definitely is a major downstep in terms of the actual plot and the story, because unfortunately this is, I think, where you're going to start to lose a lot of people. This one is where I think your mileage really starts to vary. This film is much more of a straight ahead pulp adventure like the second film, but it doesn't have the energy to it. And also Fu Manchu's goals are different, because this, as the title would indicate, is not a world domination scheme. This is simply Fu Manchu wanting to enact a plan of vengeance. He wants revenge on Sir Nayland Smith. So there's nothing in terms of it being an earth-shattering plot that is on the front burner, essentially. All that stuff is on a back burner and sort of simmering and sort of in the background for the whole film. So it doesn't have the same sort of drive to it as the first two films. And that's compounded by you really lose the key contributor to the success of the first two films, because you don't have Don Sharp there, trying to punch up the Harry Allan Towers script. And while the locale change is nice and it does add a sort of breath of fresh air, it doesn't make up for that, at least not for me and the way I view the film. This film is beloved by a great many, especially in the UK, and they discuss this in the commentary, which is understandable. But this one is much more of a straightforward kind of story, and in terms of the script, it does very much plod along, and without the sort of energy that's in the first two films, this one, it does unfortunately kind of have a bit of almost a staleness to it. But again, that's simply how I read it. And I think the individual viewer is going to have a completely different experience with the last three films in terms of the overall effectiveness, because they're so kind of all over the place that certain aspects will appeal to certain audiences and then totally not for others. But of all of the films in this 5-film series, I think this one is, technically it's the most simple, it's the most safe, it's the most generic, really. That's what I really took from it. It's not necessarily a bad film, but it just doesn't really do anything to differentiate itself. The biggest thing is Fu Manchu's plan of revenge, which involves essentially creating a double of Nayland Smith and getting him to do these terrible things to essentially discredit Nayland Smith and humiliate him and make the real Nayland Smith just have to watch everything. But this also means that you take Nayland Smith out of the equation for the vast majority of the plot, and so Douglas Wilmer has returned, but he doesn't really get to do a whole lot of anything, because he's either simply reacting for his little bits throughout the rest of the film, or he's of course playing the fake or false Nayland Smith and not saying a word and not getting to emote or do much of anything, which gave him not a very good overall opinion of this film, which they discussed in the commentary as well. That this was probably the point at which where he had decided that he would not continue with the series because that didn't really give him anything to do. So it definitely holds your story back when you essentially take your lead and a hero and the opposition to your antagonist, well, you just take him off the playing field and you remove him out of the equation, and so then you don't have that wonderful, delicious, necessary back and forth between the hero and villain. So it's a film that it's kind of a hard sell, because again, there is a sort of a feeling of almost stagnation to how the plot unfurls, and it becomes a bit perfunctory. And so it's just going to be the boldness of the colors and the photography, which really do leap out of this new transfer, and seeing Lee again play his version of Fu Manchu, and the fact that the film was shot in Hong Kong, and how it adds a different sort of flavor to the proceedings. So this one, again, I think is the simplest of the films, and this one, it does have a bit of an air of being a bit generic in terms of how it feels, and especially coming off the first two films Don Sharp directed, it's just it's a complete 180. In terms of the energy level is just it's so much. I mean, there's a little bit there, but it's just. It's like when you have very little gas in the tank and your car starts sputtering because the engine is running on fumes. There's a bit of that feeling. Again, it's not a bad film, but if this were the first or only experience you had with these films, then you might wonder why anybody would talk about them very much. However, this film does have a great fan base, and they even mentioned this in the commentary that a lot of people in the UK grew up with these films because they would be run a lot on television. So a lot of kids saw them and saw them over and over and over again. And this one being the simplest and the most straightforward, this one, you could actually see it as done as a serial as well, just like the first two films. So at least it still has that. You can get the sense that it is still connected in that way to the first two films. But I think if you're coming to this series and you're watching them for the first time and you're watching them in chronological order, there is a significant sort of nosedive in terms of the overall effectiveness and the energy after the first two films. And so for me, Don Sharp is the key player in all of these. And once he's gone, you know it, even if you just had no clue or didn't pay attention to the credits. You would know that somebody had pulled the energy plug out after the first two films. Again, this is nothing against Jeremy Summers, who does a good job with what he has, but I don't think any director could have done a whole lot with this story. And I think had Don Sharp stayed around and directed this film in Hong Kong as well, he would have had a lot of the same challenges. And I think even he would have had trouble because the story it's just not as good as the first two. And again, dramatically, it's nowhere near as engaging. I think this is where the sort of plotting aspect of these scripts does definitely start to become a big negative factor. So this one, I think your results are definitely going to vary. It is, again, the most straightforward of all of these films. It is, a little bit, goofy in its way, again, because you have the Douglas Wilmer basically spending most of the film playing the false Nayland Smith and just kind of standing around and not having any expression on his face. And so it's a little amusing in that way, which of course is not trying to be, but it is what it is, unfortunately. But again, your results may vary because some people find this a really fun experience. Although I can't agree with the commentators because they start their track by saying this is their favorite and the best of the series, and whatever it was they were smoking when they thought that, I don't know, because this is just not on the same level as the first two films. But again, your results may vary because again, the commentators themselves love the heck out of this film, and I've read a great many people express similar opinions. I just myself think it is obviously a weaker film in terms of, pretty much everything. the one really big different factor that gives it some spice and some flavor and some energy is the fact that they shot it in Hong Kong, so the locales are different, and a lot of the costumes are lovingly embroidered and have these really bold colors. So, however, I say all of that, and as much as I think this film is problematic and never really gets going enough to really feel satisfying, The Vengeance of Fu Manchu is King Lear in comparison to what follows and how the series ends in the fourth and fifth films. So if you were like me and you're watching these films for the first time in chronological order with this indicator set, be warned. I'll just put it that way. So to talk about the picture and audio quality, again, this is a 4K scan of the original camera negative by Indicator Powerhouse. Again, this is very much archivally minded, so there is occasionally some very minor printed in bits of dirt and damage and things, but they're all, again, very minor. However, I will say they are more prominent here than in the first two films. I don't know if that has something to do with the Hong Kong production of this and the fact that there were obviously different crew members and they were in another country. And on top of that, again, I'm sure these films, in terms of the elements, were not stored properly all the time due to how many just crazy stories that surrounded Harry Allan Towers. I'm sure that also might play into it a little bit. But in this film, you are going to notice more bits of damage that pop up. Again, even though they are still relatively minor and most people are probably not going to notice them, you're going to notice them more in this versus the first two films because they're more prominent. And again, I think that just is probably due to the fact that they shot it in Hong Kong and it wasn't done in the UK. The bits I'm talking about manifest mostly as quite a bit of dirt and the occasional mark or two. So that's really what they're popping up as. There's maybe one or two spots of some slight frame wobble here and there, but all of it seems intrinsic to the original source. Nothing in terms of it being damaged that happened after the fact. And so it pretty much is what it is, and Indicator has done their due diligence in transferring the film exactly as it is. There's also one or two spots where there is some quality loss, but again, that seems intrinsic to the source. I don't know if that's simply they had to dupe a certain small section, or if it was just a different film stock that was used on that particular shot or something. But I did notice that in one or two very brief moments. So again, nothing that seems out of the ordinary for a production of this type. It's all just intrinsic stuff to the original material. Now, in terms of the overall quality effect, this is a beautiful looking transfer. You're going to notice the colors really seem rich and vibrant. And again, the whole flavor of the film is different, which is what pretty much everybody comes away with when they talk about this film in particular, that it has a certain opulence to the visuals. It has a different feel. Even the costumes that Fu Manchu wears, that Christopher Lee is wearing throughout, they seem to have a greater sense of texture to them. Fu Manchu's base of operations is in an actual castle, and it does seem very much in a real-world location, which adds another element of realism to the villain's lair. And you really do get the sense that we're in another part of the world here. And again, the fact that this was shot in Hong Kong, you would know that even if you didn't know about the production facts. You would get the sense that they obviously have made this somewhere else that was nowhere near where the first two films were made. So that there's a certain sort of nice exotic quality to this film compared to the first two, and that really comes across in this transfer, which is just beautiful looking outside of the inherent issues that pop up here and there that are all inherent to the original source photography. Now, the fact that this film was made in Hong Kong primarily also means that the audio is pretty much entirely post-synchronized. And so obviously the audio is never going to fully match the lips, and that also gives it, for it being, obviously an English language film, it does give it a slight feeling of cheapness, or obviously it's going to seem much more like a foreign film or an Italian film that obviously they were all post-synchronized. So you also lose sync sound with the third film, which doesn't help in terms of that sort of, I mean, I hate to say it, but there is a slight feeling of cheapness to this film. And of course, talking about cheapness and Harry Allan Towers, it kind of goes hand in hand. Because all you have to do is hear one anecdote, and then you're like, okay, I get the idea. But that also means that the track itself is not up to the same quality standard as the first two films. So we do get a nice lossless presentation of the original mono audio here. It has, like the other two films, not been aggressively cleaned up. It's pretty much an as-is presentation, but because this is a post-synchronized track from 1967 that was primarily done in Hong Kong, there is quite a bit of inherent noise. There are moments of inherent hum. There is some distortion here and there in the track. There is obviously a difference in the overall quality when compared to the first two films. So if you're watching these and you get to the third film and you kind of wonder why the audio seems a bit different and why it seems a bit noisier, and then you may notice the fact that the lips are not always matching the words being spoken, and some characters, because these were multinational productions, again with a lot of different actors and actresses from different countries, they're not always speaking the same language. So it's very much the same feeling you get when you see an Italian Western, where you've got Obviously, on the set, there would be somebody speaking German, somebody speaking English, somebody speaking Italian, French, so on and so forth. There's a little bit of that here, but that does mean it does suffer sonically because it is not a sync sound film. So this one, in terms of the audio presentation, you are going to notice more inherent audio defects and things that are not there in the first two films, simply because this was a post-sync sound or a redubbed film, just like a lot of foreign films at that time. Now we talk about the packaging. This has the gorgeous, very striking original poster artwork, beautifully printed, so the very blood red color just jumps off this digipack. We have this custom spine. And we have the interior artwork with alternate poster. Also, keep that image in mind because you're going to see this image again, actually. This is the German poster, but it was actually reused as one of the posters of the next film. Then we have the very striking disc tray image. Then the rear with the absolutely stuffed supplemental features package once again. So to go over those, we have the new restoration from a 4K scan of the original negative with the original mono audio. We have a brand new audio commentary with, again, Kevin Lyons and Jonathan Rigby, who do their usual wonderful job, although I can't agree with them that this is the best of the series. I still don't know how they came up with that, but again, I think that might have some definite childhood nostalgia behind that, because they do talk about how they grew up seeing the first three films on British television a lot, and of these films, this one probably would be much more accessible to kids. But I get it, but also in terms of the overall film strength, this is nowhere near the first two films. So I'm still like, I don't know what they were smoking, but it's like it's their opinion. I get it. I respect it, but I don't quite get it at the same time, actually. But it's still a wonderful, essential must-listen commentary track. Then the second commentary track, essentially, is another BEHP interview, this time with Jeremy Summers, who talks about his entire career, does mention this film briefly. Now, this one only runs 72 minutes, so it's a commentary track presentation, so it runs a little bit shorter than the actual film by about 20 minutes or so. So you'd listen to this, and then it would just then play the end of the film audio for the last 20 minutes. But still, it's another of these absolutely essential treasure trove BEHP interviews. Then we get another introduction by Vic Pratt, who goes into the film's history in a beautiful, wonderfully worded introduction that will set up the world of this film and its production if you've never seen it before, and also give you some nice background detail even if you're familiar with this film. So it's really best to watch all of these introductions with these films when you actually watch them. I actually watched it afterwards because I kind of have a thing. I like to do that, so that way I get the context, but I don't get the actual, I see the film without any prior knowledge about the plot or anything. But he does a great job of covering all of the high points and not spoiling any of the plot details, so you can watch them before or after, just whichever is your preference. Then we get an incredible 50-minute piece entitled Tall, Lean, and Feline, which is Jonathan Rigby talking about the early career of Christopher Lee. And you may think that you know a great deal about Lee's career, and and the fact that this is 50 minutes, even though it's Jonathan Rigby, you might think, oh, well, I'm sure I probably know most of this information. No. He does a wonderful job, as always, of going into not just the biographical details and the production details of the various films and detailing Christopher Lee's eventual path to film stardom. That did, of course, take quite some time. But he also goes into great analysis about the career trajectory that Lee went on and how it was very much came and went in fits and starts, and it was very frustrating, and it's kind of amazing in some ways that he stuck with it as long as he did. But it's another essential must-watch extra, and it's 50 minutes long, and you wish it was longer. It's that well done. And of course, being Jonathan Rigby, you would expect that. But it's another one of these absolutely phenomenal. You forget the time and you just watch the whole thing in one go. Then we get a brand new filmed interview entitled The Checks in the Post, which is with the first assistant director, Anthony Way, who remembers the making of this film and discusses his relationship with Harry Allan Towers. And the title of this piece should indicate it does have several Towers anecdotes, and the title, The Checks in the Post, does actually refer to the anecdote that he tells about Towers and the fact that he had still not been paid for his services on these films. So encountering him years later and being told, "Oh, checks in the post." But it's a wonderful, it's a 5-minute little interview made for this release in 2020, and I absolutely love these pieces that Indicator does with the surviving original key crew members who are very much, sort of bemused in a way, talking about these events all these years later, and then you see all these memories come flooding back, and getting that first-person, first-hand experience is always so incredibly rewarding. And then, if that were not enough, Indicator has, once again in one of these sets, included an entire supplemental feature film, which is actually a film Jeremy Summers directed for the Children's Film Foundation. This is entitled The Ghost of Monk's Island. It was originally done as a chapter serial, actually, but it was condensed down into this 93-minute feature film. This is presented in standard definition. However, it's still in rather nice quality, and it's a fun little children's adventure film, much like some of the other CFF films that Indicator has put in their various sets and supplemental features packages. And Summers had done work for the CFF, and this is more of where he sort of came from before moving into feature films. So it's fascinating seeing some of his other work. And again, it's not often that you get an entire supplemental feature film included in the supplements on a standalone Blu-ray. So I really appreciate these the additional efforts Indicator takes to really promote certain aspects of the British film industry that are obviously no longer existing and are an artifact of their time, and they're fascinating to study. So if you want to know more about Summers' career and films and types of things he did before breaking into feature films, well, you can see the entirety of The Ghost of Monk's Island. We also get an alternative title sequence, which is newly scanned in HD. The original trailer is included. It is scanned in HD and the 1.66 ratio, which is always wonderful. We get the typical of Indicator, absolutely stuffed image gallery with loads of beautiful high-resolution images of original production stills, lobby cards, posters, foreign posters, and the whole ad campaign. Then finally, new and improved English subtitles, and this is the film's Blu-ray premiere. So this is an interesting film. It's very much middle of the road. Some people will love it, some people will hate it, but it's definitely the most average feeling, I would say. There is a sort of hint, though, I should mention, of another type of film creeping in, because they did shoot this at the Shaw Studios, and there are one or two fight sequences that start and almost start to suggest a little bit of the Shaw style. And to be honest, the film could have used that, and had that come in full force, this could have technically been one of the first crossover breakthrough kung fu films, and really predated the kung fu craze that really took off, of course, in the early to mid 70s around the Bruce Lee films. So you can definitely get a sense there's a little bit of that in the two main fight scenes that start up, but unfortunately get curtailed way too quickly. It's a shame they didn't sort of run with that, because again, had they done that, this could have technically been one of, if not the first, sort of crossover kung fu film. Then we come to the fourth film in the series, which is, of course, 1968, The Blood of Fu Manchu. And the big, gigantic, inescapable thing that happens with this series for the last two films is that Harry Allan Towers made a number of films with Jess Franco. And whether you're a fan of Franco or not, he has a very particular style. I myself am not a Franco fan. I've seen several of his other films, even the Dracula film that he made with Christopher Lee, and I really can't stand them. And as I said before, when you get to Vengeance of Fu Manchu, even if you don't like it, it's positively Shakespearean in comparison to the final two films that Franco directed of this series for Harry Allan Towers. Now, you're still dealing with Harry Allan Towers writing the scripts, but these last two films really have nothing to do with the three films that preceded them. I don't even think you can even comprehend the plots they're supposed to have, to be honest, if you can even call them plots. They're quite known for being terrible, and the final film, Castle of Fu Manchu, is generally regarded as being the absolute worst, and was even covered on Mystery Science Theater 3000. However, I think this film, Blood of Fu Manchu, is far worse. I have to preface this because this is absolutely dire. This is one of the worst films I've ever seen in my life. Your enjoyment factor here is going to be, getting through it for the bits of Christopher Lee and Sai Chen being playing the characters again, and that's really your only linkage to the other three films. Howard Marion Crawford does reappear as Dr. Petrie, but he's turned into a complete buffoonish character, and he's also in the film very little. As I said, Douglas Wilmer was no longer interested in playing Nayland Smith, so we have recast again, and this time it's Richard Greene, who seems like a great idea. However, they have magnified the problem of Vengeance of Fu Manchu even more because Richard Greene is only in this film for all of maybe 5 to 10 minutes here and there, and most of the time he's in character, sick and dying because he's been poisoned with this insidious plot to Fu Manchu, and he's basically on death's door and blind. So he basically disappears for 95% of the film and pops up for the last 20 seconds. And to be honest, he should be grateful for that because this film is so incredibly dire that I wouldn't wish it upon anyone to appear in this. You kind of know what you're in for by the fact that this film opens literally with Christopher Lee sitting in a cave with Sai Chen next to him, and it looks incredibly cheap, and then for no reason at all they're surrounded by a bunch of scantily clad women, mostly nude, who have some chains on them, and they're obviously some kind of bondage, and why is never explained, but it's Jess Franco, and you're just in for the ride. The film is filled with constant crash zooms for no reason. That's nothing new to any Franco fans, or if you've ever seen a Franco film before. This pretty much has his sort of style, if you want to call it that, all over it. But this being earlier and not a very well regarded film, I don't even think that Franco fans find a lot in this film to really write home about, because this is incredibly difficult to sit through. It is. This is a film that also, for some reason, randomly seems to take place mostly in a jungle location. And again, Fu Manchu's lair is literally inside of a cave. And the reasons are because his plot involves basically extracting some poison or venom from the jungle, and then using the reason, I guess, why the naked women are always around, as he uses them as his weapons of vengeance and fills them with this venom. So when they go and kiss their victims, they transfer the said poison to them and then pretty much just die. And he does this to Nayland Smith, and then that's why Richard Greene basically has maybe 90 seconds of screen time playing Nayland Smith before he's suddenly afflicted, and then he's in maybe a combined total of 5 to 7 minutes of the rest of the film, just kind of, doing the whole I'm blind and half dead routine. So he is completely wasted in this film, unfortunately. And then on top of that, as I said, Dr. Petrie is turned into a total buffoon character, but he's even barely in the film. So he's only reduced to a few short scenes of attempts at comic relief, but they don't really land. Nothing in this film lands. Nothing in this film makes any sense. And it is so ineptly made that it is a slog to get through without falling asleep. I literally started to fall asleep while trying to get through this. It is that dire, and I use that word because that's the only thing I can think of. This also is notable for claiming that Shirley Eaton is in the cast, and you do indeed see a random scene towards the end where suddenly we're in what seems like a completely different movie, and there's one scene of Shirley Eaton, and she has like maybe a line of dialogue or two, and you're wondering what's going on. Well, the reason is that is from a different different movie. They literally shoved in a scene from a movie that Franco and Towers made together that had nothing to do with this, simply to get Shirley Eaton's name for marquee value, and she herself was not even aware of this. It's the only anecdote there is about this film, that decades after the fact, she found out that she was apparently in a film she had never heard of. They figured out it was simply because they shoved a scene from another film entirely in. And to be honest, that film looks far more interesting, even though it doesn't look very good. This film also randomly seems to turn into an Italian Western halfway through for a good chunk of it. We even have an actor from the Sergio Leone canon as sort of this larger-than-life, lusty bandit character in the middle of the South American jungle. Why this happens, no one knows. At least it gives us something to react to, but it makes no sense, and we spend a good chunk of the film basically in a Italian Western in the jungle for no apparent reason. And of course, like the previous film, this entire film is dubbed, is post-synchronized, so none of the voices match the lip movements, and that it makes the film feel even cheaper than it looks and clearly is. It is so dire that you simply don't care. You want it to end. And you feel bad for Christopher Lee and Sai Chen being in this, but they soldier on in their few scenes, and Lee does display at least a little bit of energy when he does get to do a villain monologue for a minute or two towards the end. But there is nothing in this film to recommend. There is nothing of any spark of creativity. This is the absolute bottom of the barrel. This is the pits. This is completely inept. I can't put it more bluntly than that. This is a completely inept film that was made by people who seemingly had no sense of story construction or how to make a movie without every other shot being a random crash zoom for no apparent reason. If you hate crash zooms, you're going to be screaming at the screen, to be honest. This is one of the worst films I've ever sat through. I was very tempted to stop, but I wanted to finish the series, and I had heard, you read about these films and you read about how bad Castle is, the final film, but to be honest, and I'll get into it more when I discuss that film, at least that film sort of commits to its craziness, if that makes sense. Whereas Blood of Fu Manchu, it's just so dull. Even when you've got weird stuff going on and there's, a whole cave full of mostly naked women who are sometimes getting whipped or thrown into a prison cell and all kinds of weird things for no reason, you just don't care. You want it to end, and it keeps going. Even though the runtime isn't, super long or anything, it's just unbearable. So I would recommend this only to fans of Jess Franco, or the diehard Christopher Lee fans who have to see every film he ever made, or if you're watching these films and you're going through and you want to see how they developed and you have a morbid curiosity about bad films, well, here you go. Blood of Fu Manchu ticks all those boxes, but it is a film I would recommend to no one else outside of those reasons, because this is just unbelievably dire. Even people who love watching bad movies simply for getting an enjoyment factor out of it, you're gonna have a tough time with this because it's so bad and it's so boring and so dull that you just don't care. You just want it to end, and the end is a relief. It is such a relief, and I honestly don't know if I will ever revisit this film. That's how bad it is. But there are apparently some who get some sort of enjoyment out of it, or watching the absolute mess continue to unfold. But for all the criticism that is out there about Castle of Fu Manchu, at least as unbelievably bad as that film is, at least it commits to how insane and crazy it is, and you can have fun because it's totally kooky. Whereas Blood of Fu Manchu is just dead in the water, unbelievably dull, and completely incompetently made. I mean, this is a film you should show in film school as an example of how to screw everything up. Like, it's so inept and incompetent. It really, you can't believe how incompetently put together this is. It pretty much it tries to break every single rule in the how to make a film and it not look like utter crap 101 handbook. So this film is not for the faint of heart in terms of if you can't stand a film that's poorly made. Oh boy, this is just dire. So I commend Indicator for even giving the Blood of Fu Manchu this incredible level of wonderful archival presentation, but this is an unbelievably hard film to get through. It is absolutely one of the worst films I've ever seen in my life. To talk about the picture quality, we once again have a beautiful new 4K negative scan. It again has a lot of intrinsic problems, and much more so than the previous three films, because it's very clear they really cheaped out on the budget, and I'm sure they were not worrying about, clearing hairs in the gate and storing the film properly and preserving it and things. So the last two Franco films of the Fu Manchu series have quite a bit more damage and variation and things that are inherent to the source compared to even the three films that preceded them. So you're going to notice a little bits of, occasional frame wobble, some dirt, some specks, a little bit of a mark or two here and there. There is one instance where it seems like there is maybe it seems just like one missing frame. But again, all of this seems baked into just how cheap and not very good this production was. Again, I mean, your movie opens with Christopher Lee literally just sitting in a cave, looking into the camera. So I'm like, you know what you're in for when you start this. So don't go into this expecting the same visual quality as the previous three films, because again, the ineptitude I mentioned is there in the photography as well. And again, if you hate zoom lenses, this is going to be unbearable, because it seems every other shot is a zoom shot for no reason. Even when you think it's not a zoom shot, guess what? It turns into a zoom shot, which also, of course, cuts back on your quality as well. However, the quality of the 4K scan from the original negative, Indicator's presentation, and being very hands-off and archivally minded is beautiful. So you can marvel at the visuals of this completely terrible film, but do keep in mind the amount of inherent damage and things is increased over the previous three films simply due to the cheaper nature of the production. The audio does also have some of that as well. This again is completely post-sync, so it is all dubbed dialogue. The quality is not the greatest. It does have a sort of built-in canned factor to it, as all of these cheap productions having dubbed tracks would be. It doesn't even sound as good as the mono for the previous film, which was also post-sync audio. So again, the whole production feels incredibly cheap. There are some inherent things going on in this track, a little bit of hiss and hum here and there. Nothing major, but you are going to notice it. And again, nothing's going to hide how cheaply this production was carried off. And again, that's even in the audio, which is all post-sync. Here we have the beautifully rendered artwork. And as I said before, this poster reuses the image from the German poster for Vengeance of Fu Manchu. So that was recycled, but it still looks beautiful on this. And here's the spine. Then here is the interior. And then for the disc tray. And then the rear with substantial supplemental features. So to talk about those, we have the new 4K restoration from the original negative. There are two presentations of the film, because like a lot of Towers films, there are multiple titles, and these last two Fu Manchu films were not very popular with distributors. No one wanted to put them out, especially not here in the US. So by this time, the series had really run its course, but they kept making them with the last two, and so they exist under several different titles. So we get the option to view it with the original Blood of Fu Manchu title, but then the Indicator has also included the alternative title sequence for the film's Kiss Me to Death title, which makes sense with the semblance of plot with the women full of poison kissing their intended victims, but it's just a really generic and silly sounding title. But I'm very glad that the alternative presentation was included here for the opening title sequence. We do get a new audio commentary for the film with David Flint and Adrian J. Smith. It's a solid commentary, but it would be challenging for anyone to give a commentary on this film because it's just so bad, and I don't even know what you talk about other than just how nuts it is throughout. So I don't blame them for talking about other things than the film. They do talk a lot about Franco and Towers and their careers and how they intersected and some of the other films in this series. But yeah, I can understand why the commentary frequently they're talking about other things, and I don't blame them at all. But even they had to keep acknowledging how just weird and messy this film is. Then we get Vic Pratt doing another introduction, which is beautifully stated and worded, so it's another essential view. Then we get a 41-minute piece with Stephen Thrower entitled The Men Who Killed Fu Manchu, talking specifically about the final two films in this series, bringing together Jess Franco as director and to the Harry Allan Towers world, and how these two films firmly put the nail in the coffin of this series of Fu Manchu films and seemingly all other cinematic adaptations of the character. So this is another essential piece. He tries to explain some of the madness of these last two films, but even at 41 minutes, you just can't even begin to explain the mind-boggling insanity of these last two films. But at least he tries, and it's a beautiful, essential watch if you decide to view these last two films of the cycle. Then we get another of the newly done interviews with Ray Andrew, who is the clapper loader at this time, talking about Harry Allan Towers and Fu Manchu. And this piece is entitled Any Way to Save Money. That speaks volumes about how these films were made. And by this point, it seems like they didn't have any money left to save. But it's another essential piece from a first-hand source, giving you the exact ins and outs of how these later productions went, even compared to the earlier films. And then, in a really incredible touch, the Indicator has included one of the surviving episodes from the original 1923 Fu Manchu British serial entitled The Mystery of Fu Manchu. This episode is The Fiery Hand, which runs 37 minutes. This is a fascinating artifact. It definitely has a particular pace and is trying to draw from the Fu Manchu stories, but it's fascinating to see them attempt this in 1923 and to have this survive. There is a new score by the band Peninsula that was done for this. An Indicator includes a chapter from the following sequel serial for 1924 on the next disc. We get some more alternative title sequences. Some are in SD because they seem to be video titles from various video releases, but those are fascinating to see some of the other ways the film was sold under other titles. Then we get some fascinating color tests which survive and are in HD. So you see Christopher Lee and Sai Chen around the one or two sets in candid moments with the color slate and things. So that's at least a nice touch, and it's HD footage. So apparently they must have found that when scanning the original negative. We get the original UK theatrical trailer, which is in HD from a new scan. We get the US Kiss and Kill titled theatrical trailer, which is in standard definition. And amusingly there, they didn't even want to say Lee was playing Fu Manchu. He's literally just called in the trailer Mr. Evil, which is just like, that shows you how much no one in the US wanted this film at that time. They didn't even want to say the character that Lee was playing. They just say Mr. Evil, which is just hysterical. Then we also get another stuffed image gallery with beautiful high-res images, new and improved English subtitles, and this is the film's UK premiere on Blu-ray. So I can't say it enough. This is the low point of the series for me, and definitely going to be a hard watch for most anyone. So I do want to warn people, if you're going to watch this series for the first time, no, the last two films kind of just go off the deep end completely. But this film, I think, is just absolutely dire, unfortunately. So this one is I think only for the morbidly curious or the diehard Franco fans, or fans of other films in this series who want to watch all of them. After the whole experience of the Blood of Fu Manchu, you would think that most sensible people would realize that the series was finished, and even when distributors didn't want to put the film out and wanted to pretend it wasn't a Fu Manchu film, you would think that you'd probably stop and call it a day. However, Harry Allan Towers did not do this, and we got the fifth and final film in the series, The Castle of Fu Manchu from 1969, which was released under a bunch of different titles and not always in 1969. In fact, it didn't come out here for a while afterwards. Once again, directed by Jess Franco, which, if you saw the previous film, you might think you might have wanted to get a different director. However, they pretty much just carried on and made one more Fu Manchu film that is even more completely insane and wacky than Blood of Fu Manchu. This film does not make a lick of sense. It's to try and describe its plot, to even call it a plot, is just insane. And it has one of the most shameless openings of a film I've ever seen, in terms of this film actually decides to open with a sort of, opening action set piece. And the way they do this, because of course the film had no money, they reused the entire ending of the second film, which I consider the best of the series. So they take the ending of control room scenes only, mind you, of the Brides of Fu Manchu, with Christopher Lee interacting with Burt Kwok and Sai Chen and everybody. And then they intercut that with duped footage from the classic A Night to Remember, when the Titanic sinks in that film. Except they just tinted it blue to make you supposedly not notice that it was A Night to Remember footage, and they sort of sped it up a little bit. And they intercut these two sources together from two pre-existing films to try and bang together a new sequence. It does not work at all. I think anybody would know they were from two different films, even if they'd never seen the other films before. Has nothing really to do with this film, except for trying to set up the fact that Fu Manchu is up to something, and he managed to sink a ship. But they couldn't go and just shoot even a cheap model of a ship sinking. They literally decided it was better to bang together this sequence out of two pre-existing films with poor quality duped footage. And it's one thing to take footage from your own film, but then to literally go to a well-known, iconic, and beloved film that is still regarded by a great many as probably the best Titanic film, and then just think you can bash them together. It is unbelievable. It has to be seen to be believed. And in fact, it's so audacious that once you get over the initial surprise and I can't believe they did this factor, it actually becomes kind of hysterically amusing in a way. It's still painful to watch these two far better films be manipulated in this way, but it's so bold and audacious and wacky that somebody would come up with this idea and literally do it and think they could get away with it, that you kind of eventually just go, well, I'm in for an interesting ride, I guess. And you sort of just can't help but laugh. It's so unbelievably insane. It is one of the most shameless reusages of film footage you're ever going to see, because it's not just from one film, it's from two completely unrelated films smashed together, and stealing footage from what is, I think, the best climax of the same series that this is the final film of. I mean, it's like... If this does not convince you this is a terrible film opening up, I don't know what will. But again, this factor that I alluded to before, at least this film commits to its craziness. This film is filled with all kinds of nonsensical stuff. There's a surgery set piece that takes place that seems like it drags on for 5 or 10 minutes in ridiculous extra detail that is unnecessary, but at least something is happening, unlike the entirety of Blood of Fu Manchu, where very little to nothing of interest ever happens. Richard Greene again returns as Nayland Smith. He does actually get some things to do in this film, so it's already better because of that. He doesn't get a whole whole lot to do, but at least he gets some actual dialogue scenes and isn't staggering around like a half-dead person who's pretending to be blind. Unfortunately, Dr. Petrie is still an even more turned into a comic buffoon-type character, but it's still Howard Marion Crawford, and at least he gets a few more scenes, although they're just kind of wasted. Interestingly, Jess Franco actually casts himself in the film as one of the local police that Nayland Smith interacts with, and I kind of knew what Franco looked like, and I had to stop for a minute and go, wait a minute, is that... You have to actually look for a second, but he did do that at times, so he actually does have an acting role in the film, if the film wasn't bizarre enough. Fu Manchu's plot at least sort of makes a little bit more sense than his almost non-existent plot in the previous film, but essentially it boils down to he has a secret formula for creating icebergs, and he's going to sink ships because that's going to help him take over the world for some reason, but he needs additional formula pieces from a scientist who is in need of an operation, which is why we get the overextended operation sequence. That is the bare minimum of plot that you can extract from this film, because it is surrounded by just tons of other crazy, wacky, nonsensical stuff. We do have some real location footage again, but the actual set of Fu Manchu's lair inside the historical sort of the historical palace that he's taken over is very cheap, but they do at least fill it with a lot of colored gel lighting, so it does give it some trappings of a horror film. And on these supposed to be underground lair bits, if you didn't have the colored gel lighting everywhere, then it would look as cheap as it really was. So at least, as with a lot of things in this film, there is a little bit of flavor here and there. There are some things going on. Lee's performance is actually, I think, a bit more energetic than he had been since the first two films. So I think Lee's performance is actually his best as Fu Manchu in these films since Brides of Fu Manchu. So there's another little benefit, even though he doesn't really get a lot to do. And by the end, as with most of these films, particularly the final three, he kind of stands around looking like an idiot, and you wonder, did you not have a backup plan, for getting out? This, again, like Blood of Fu Manchu, is a film that you are, definitely relieved when it is over. However, because you have this factor of this film is completely wild, it makes no sense, but at least it's enjoyable to sit through and laugh at and have a fun time in trying to make sense of the weird images you're being bombarded with. You can enjoy it from that perspective. It's still an abominably bad film that deserves its reputation. And it was featured on Mystery Science Theater 3000, and even they couldn't find a lot to discuss about it because it's so bad. But at least it commits to its badness. It doesn't have quite as many incessant crash zooms, so that does also make it a little bit better, but, it's just slightly above Blood of Fu Manchu, which is not saying very much, because both of these films are horrible, but at least this film, you can get through it, and you can sort of chuckle along with its complete zaniness. And it makes perfect sense why the series ended here. I mean, it should have really ended with the third film, to be honest, since they went in this direction instead. And these last two films really have nothing to do with the previous three films outside of Harry Allan Towers producing and writing, and it's still having Christopher Lee and Cy Chen and Howard Marion Crawford. Outside of that, they have nothing to do with the first three films. And like Blood of Fu Manchu, this is going to be a very tough film for most people to watch. It's a very tough recommendation. I wouldn't really recommend it to anybody outside of people being fans of Christopher Lee or Jess Franco, or if you're looking for a really wild, terrible film to watch as a sort of midnight movie or to watch with friends. It's much better to watch this with other people in the room, because when you're by yourself, you do start to question your sanity. It's just absolutely nuts. So this is a film that is much better with other people, or you may want to enjoy certain libations or other beverages to make it more tolerable. It is that bad. But again, at least it has a wild flavor to it that makes it digestible in that way, and you can just sort of go along for the ride. So this is another film that, it's very surprising. This now has a beautiful 4K scan from the original negative and a full archival presentation. But we are talking about Indicator, who does their absolute best for any and all films, but especially films like this that, practically no one outside of genre circles has heard of or seen. And even if they have a terrible reputation, every film deserves to be preserved properly, as even Castle of Fu Manchu has here. To move on to the picture quality, this is again a 4K scan from the original camera negative. It does have some inherent problems going on that are inherent to the source. And again, this being a much, much cheaper and crazy production like Blood of Fu Manchu was, perhaps even crazier because they seemingly had even less money. There are some inherent things going on. You are going to see some inherent, very occasional, very fleeting, but they're definitely there, some occasional marks and dirt and maybe a scratch or something poking in the frame corner just a little bit. So again, this is very much an archival presentation. These things all seemed baked into the source and seem intrinsic to the production, and they simply are what they are. The visuals, in spite of the much lesser quality of the production, do actually stand up pretty well, and particularly all the scenes in Fu Manchu's lair with the colored gel lighting really stand out well in this new 4K master presentation. So this, I think, does the absolute best that it can with this film. Again, you do have to deal with the fact that the whole opening is dupe stock footage from two different films, so the quality is really low on those. There's also another moment in the film where they take footage from a completely different film when they want to show a dam breaking. Well, they literally just lift a whole sequence from a much earlier film and just drop it in there, so that's why the quality suddenly drops. And if you look closely, you can actually see the stars of that other film just shoved into Castle of Fu Manchu. So there's a couple spots where the stock footage, well, it's not stock footage, it's footage from other films, is just shoved in there, duped in. So obviously you get a big quality drop off there. This film is obviously nowhere near as well shot as the first three films, just like Blood of Fu Manchu, so you have that factor as well. It's also in the 1.66 to 1 ratio, but overall manages to clean up beautifully because the original negative has been scanned at 4K resolution and treated as best as humanly possible by Indicator. The audio is lossless mono once again. This is another obviously post-synchronized film, and it seems very lazily done because this is the most obviously post-dubbed film. It doesn't even seem to bother to try and match the lip movements throughout frequently. So it seems to be off sync for most of the film, and that's just how it was. So this is definitely the lowest quality soundtrack of the films. There is some inherent hiss and a little bit of hum here and there, but that all is intrinsic to the source, never overwhelms anything. But yeah, this is a very, very poorly made soundtrack, and the fact that it's so wildly off sync throughout definitely adds to the whole "I can't believe what I'm watching" factor of trying to sit through the Castle of Fu Manchu. So yeah, this is a rather interesting experience, let's put it that way. Let me comment to the packaging, which has the original poster art, which does look pretty good, but of course it is rather generic, this being Castle of Fu Manchu. It is beautifully printed on the Indicator digipack, and there is the spine. The interior also looks lovely with other foreign poster art, this being the German poster, and then here is the disc tray. And then the rear with the number of extras. This does still have a nice supplemental package, but it is far less in terms of the amount of extras because we're talking about Castle of Fu Manchu. There's not a whole lot you can say about this film. So to go over the extras, we have the new 4K restoration with the original mono audio. We once again have two different presentations with the main Castle of Fu Manchu title sequence and then the alternative title sequence under the alternative title of Assignment Istanbul, because the film is primarily set in Istanbul, and again, a lot of distributors seem to try to pretend these were not Fu Manchu films because Fu Manchu was not a marketable commodity in the early 70s, and they wanted to pretend these were other films entirely. And like the previous film, a lot of countries did not get these films released until years after their production because, again, no one really wanted them. Also, the Istanbul titles are presented in HD from a new scan as well, so that's a nice touch. We get another Vic Pratt introduction, which is just as wonderful as the previous ones, and he also talks about the inherent craziness of this film and how it firmly killed off the series, period. Then we get the piece From Alicante to Istanbul, which is 13 minutes with the actor Rosalba Neri, and she talks in great detail about her experience on this film, her experiences with Harry Allan Towers, some of the other cast, and making other films with Jess Franco as well. She's very candid and seems like a wonderful person. It's a beautiful interview, and you just get wrapped up in the conversation she's having. She's not speaking in English, but Indicator has wonderfully subtitled the whole interview, so that's not a hurdle at all. But this is just another one of these wonderful, very engaging first-person remembrances, really. It's not really an interview, it's more of a remembrance, and she goes into all these wonderful details about the production and how they did manage to have some bits of fun making these, as sort of crazy and low budget and all over the place as these productions were. So that's a wonderful inclusion here, and I loved sitting through it. I wish it was even longer, but it's a nice 13-minute remembrance. And then by this point in the extras, you've heard a lot about Harry Allan Towers. So we get an interview with the man himself from 2008, which runs 45 minutes, and it runs the gamut talking about his entire career. And he, of course, has many stories to tell and many anecdotes he tries to shoot down. So you definitely get a sense of how much of a character this man was, first in all the anecdotes and stories, and then hearing it straight from the horse's mouth. So this is an incredible must-watch inclusion, especially if you've sat through all of these films. You've got to watch the interview with the producer and writer and man behind all of this, and all the anecdotes you've now heard about. So that's wonderful, and of course perfect to include on the final disc. Then we also get another of the Fu Manchu serial episodes. As I said, this is the 1924 sequel, The Further Mysteries of Fu Manchu, and this is the coughing horror episode, which runs 31 minutes. And Fu Manchu does manage to get Nayland Smith in his clutches and threatens him with a nice, nasty torture. This again has a new HD scan presentation, and it has a new score by the band Peninsula, so it's another fascinating historical artifact to watch through and see how these kinds of stories were handled even this early in an early 1924 silent serial. And we also get some more alternative title sequences. These are these are standard definition, but they do display a different sort of color timing from what seems like an old Video Master. We get an HD scan of the film's original trailer, which even includes the bits of the other films in the trailer, which is just absolutely hysterical and unbelievable. They did that to try to pretend, I guess, like they have more production value. It's also got a pretty funny narrator voice running throughout, so it's kind of a blast to sit through. So that's a lovely inclusion. And in HD, we get the again, rather stuffed image gallery with lovely images, typical of Indicator, new and improved English subtitles, and this is the film's UK Blu-ray premiere. So again, like Blood of Fu Manchu, for Castle of Fu Manchu, its reputation definitely precedes itself. This is a terrible film in every sense of the word. However, this is the one of the two final Jess Franco films in the Fu Manchu cycle that I do think is much more enjoyable and much easier to get through, because at least it understands it's completely nuts and will not bore you because it's completely nuts. So I do think this film is at least, thankfully, slightly better than Blood of Fu Manchu, but yeah, these last two films are really rough to get through. So I would definitely recommend for people new to these films, definitely start with the first two films and then go from there, because if you start with the final two films, you're never going to want to look at the other films. So do keep in mind the last two films directed by Jess Franco really are in a completely different realm of just general insanity. Then to talk about the actual box packaging itself, we get Indicator's lovely hard case design with the very striking imagery, and then the sort of band or belly band that they have on all their releases. So this has all of the titles, of course, the spine title, one of the lovely original taglines, and then each of the covers for the films and the limited edition numbering. Unfortunately, this box set is sold out now, but all of the discs are still available as standard editions with all of the extensive supplemental features still intact. However, you can still find this set on the used market, and I do highly recommend it, as with all indicator sets, because the attention to detail and quality is off the charts, as evidenced by the beautiful artwork here that then also goes onto the spine. And then the rear has the overall listing of the unbelievably substantial supplements, which, when you add them all up, total nearly 24 hours of supplemental material, including multiple commentaries and an entire supplemental feature film and 2 serial chapters. So this is one of the most unbelievably stuffed box set programs of entirely new special features I've ever seen. And again, if you were to try and watch all of the supplements start to finish back to back, it would take you nearly 24 complete hours. Indicators also included some very lovingly made art cards, all in black and white, mostly candids of Christopher Lee on the very sets. These are all on really nice, thicker cardstock and lovingly printed, so they have a wonderful premium feel if you just wanted more close-ups of Lee as the diabolical doctor himself. So, of course, a shot from Vengeance. And then, not to be outdone, they have also included a lovely candid of Sai Chen in wonderful quality as well. And then we have to have some evidence of Castle here. So here is a lovely still from the bonkers Castle of Fu Manchu. The box also contains one of Indicator's trademark box books, because this is not a booklet. This is a nearly 120-page compendium of beautiful stills and images, brand new articles and essays on each of the films, and vintage promotional and critical material, and vintage interviews with the cast and crew as well. So these are all works of art themselves. They could easily be sold in Booksource's standalone pieces. We even get new articles and essays on Sax Rohmer and the original novels and some of the other adaptations of the character. An essay on the 60s films themselves. We get even pieces on the promotion of the films. Here's the famous Fu Manchu for Mayor campaign from the first film. Then we also even get pieces on the serials that are included. I mean, there is no stone left unturned. There's also a really lovely bit about the critical responses to the films and how they actually started out rather decent with the first film and then quickly fell off. And then even finding bits of critical information about the last 2 films is very difficult. There's also a piece on the supplemental feature film. And again, here are the pieces on the 2 serial chapters. So this is, once again, an absolutely essential Indicator book, and the books are part of the very important reasons why you should pick up the limited edition boxes before they sell out, because unfortunately, these wonderful books never carry over to the standard editions. However, the discs themselves are the same, as are all of the on-disc contents. So you will miss out on these box set exclusives. However, you still get the incredible nearly 24 hours of amazing supplemental feature content on the discs themselves. And then, not to be outdone, Indicators also included a beautiful quad poster reproduction of the Face of Fu Manchu, and then on the flip side, the UK-British quad of the sequel, The Brides of Fu Manchu. Beautifully done, bold colors and everything, beautifully printed, and very easily frameable. So there you have it, the Indicator release of their box set of the Fu Manchu cycle, where indeed the sinister minister of fear is here. This is an incredible release. This is a true archival release. This is an incredibly substantial package that shows such love and attention to care and detail for these films that have never been given this any iota of this level of treatment before, even been discussed critically. So this is very much a prime example of how Indicator treats even films that no one discusses very much in the current day and age. Films that were truly just sort of kicked to the curb or forgotten about, or films that are just plain not good. Talking about the final two films, the proper love and attention that all films deserve. And combined with brand new 4K negative scans for all 5 films, beautiful artwork and packaging, another incredible box set and book with poster and the works. And on top of that, amazing brand new extras, all created for this release, that total to nearly 24 hours. This is one of the best box sets ever made. This is one of the best Blu-ray box sets ever made for overall quality across the board. This is simply one of the best physical media releases to ever exist. This is another crown jewel in Indicator's amazing number of crown jewel releases, and one where they got to go in and do brand new 4K scans from the original camera negative for the entire series. So I cannot recommend this highly enough for people simply curious about these films. Again, unfortunately, this was limited to only 6,000 copies and has sold out. However, you can get all the same amazing transfers and the same identical discs from Indicator's website as their standard editions. But if you really want to track down the box set, it does pop up on the used market. However, it is shooting up there in price because of the amazing quality you get in Indicator box sets. But for those who missed out on it, you still can get the standard editions. And I would recommend, at the very least, I would recommend the first 2 films of this series to anyone who loves period adventure films. I think they are very well made for their time, and I think the stories are engaging, and they're very well directed, and they're, of course, must for all Christopher Lee fans. I think the third film is also very solid, but it's going to be the last 2 films, the Jess Franco films, that are very much going to be much more up to the individual viewer if you're interested in them. However, the beautiful new transfers, presentations, and supplements really do make them a much better purchasing idea, even if you don't think you're going to like the films very much. They are still very fascinating to try and study. Overall, this is a very fascinating sort of crossroads for adventure films and doing period adventures, and trying one last stab at doing the Fu Manchu character even in the mid to late 1960s. And it's understandable why a lot of people think that the best of these really represent the best of the Harry Allan Towers whole cinematic output. And after seeing these and seeing other Towers films, you can definitely kind of understand why they would say that. But this is just a fascinating cycle of films to study, and I can't thank Indicator enough for putting together such an incredible reference work. Really, this is a reference box set in terms of, it's just like pulling a reference book off the shelf in the reference section of a library. It is that unbelievably and painstakingly well done. So that is my review of Indicator's box set release of the Fu Manchu cycle, bringing together all 5 of the Christopher Lee starring, Harry Allan Towers produced Fu Manchu films of the mid to late 1960s. They are not going to be for every audience member, but they are quite beloved by a great many in the UK who saw them countless times run on television, and they have a lot of interesting factors that I think are fascinating to study. And this, combined in the beautiful Indicator package with the exhaustive supplemental features, alone make this an essential purchase. Even if you're just getting the standard edition discs themselves because you missed out on the box set, I would still highly recommend them just for the 24 hours of supplements alone, in addition to the beautiful 4K archivally minded transfers. Again, this is one of the best box sets I've ever encountered. It's one of the best box sets ever made. There is not a single thing wrong with this, and this is how I wish every box set release was done, how I wish every film release was done, even of films that are absolutely terrible, like the final 2 films in this cycle. Every film deserves its day in the sun with a proper archivally minded transfer in terms of its picture and sound, and its presentation on disc, well encoded, with as many supplements as can be thrown together that actually are meaningful and explain the history of the film, the context in which it was made, and how it should be looked at today when you're looking at the film on the physical media release itself. So I do think this belongs in the sort of legendary home video tier of the absolutely perfect releases, because this is absolutely perfect. And if everybody else could make releases to this same standard, we would all be so much better off, because it doesn't always take more money. It just takes time and care and quality control and commitment to trying to preserve these films, because that's essentially what you're doing. Is you're creating a record of these films as best as you possibly can, and that's the most important thing of the job, really, the charge of releasing films on disc. It's not simply a money making venture. It's not operating a disc label and creating physical media releases. It's creating a record of these films, because it is very much possible these will not see another release, and after this point will not have another scan or another restoration later on with better technology, and they should always be done to the best of human ability at that time. And that's what you get here in the indicator release of the Fu Manchu cycle, which again I think is one of the finest physical media releases of all time. So as always, I hope my babblings about film and film culture and physical media releases have been at least somewhat fun and informative. If you have looked at any of these indicator releases of the Fu Manchu films, whether in the box set or the standard editions, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. These are fascinating films to study, even if you don't like them or you prefer some much more than certain others. As always, please do keep supporting both studio and boutique labels by buying films on disc to help keep both physical media and film culture alive. And thank you ever so much for watching. The world shall hear from me again.